The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Q. Jesus said, "A nobleman once went off to a distant land to become king. Just before he left, he called together his 10 most trusted servants and gave each of them 10 silver coins. 'See what you can earn with this money while I am gone,' he instructed them. His fellow citizens, however, hated him and sent a delegation saying, 'We do not want this man to rule over us.' Nevertheless, he received the kingship and returned home. He summoned the servants to find out what each one had done with the money. The first one said, 'I've turned the 10 coins into 100. "Excellent,' the new king replied. 'Because you've proven trustworthy in this small matter, I'm going to put you in charge of 10 towns.' The second reported, 'I've earned 5 times what you gave me.' 'Then you'll be in charge of 5 towns,' replied the king. Another servant stepped forward and said, 'Sir, here are your coins. I kept them wrapped up in a handkerchief because you're a hard man and I'm afraid of you. You always try to get something for nothing. You reap where you have not sown.' 'Listen to what you're saying,' the king said. 'You trapped yourself by your own words. You say that I'm a difficult man and that I try to get something for nothing? If that is true, why didn't you do something with the money to make a profit? You've disobeyed me.' Turning to the others, he said, 'Take the silver coins from him and give them to the fellow who turned 10 coins into 100. "'But sir,' they protested, 'he already has 100 coins.' 'Yes,' the king replied, 'and to the person who has something, more will be given, and that person will have abundance. The person who has nothing of real value will lose even what he thinks he has.' Jesus then said to his followers, 'You have stayed close to me through all my trials. You will eat and drink with me in the kingdom of God.'" The Gospel of the Lord. It is a great privilege to be able to attend the birth of a baby. I've had that privilege 3 times in my life. The first time as an observer, the second time as a participant, and the third time as the midwife. The first time was in 1973, and I had arrived in Kenya a few months, and I'd been sent to a mission called Eldama Ravine. I was the pastor in Eldama Ravine. And there was a big hospital on the compound run by Irish nuns from Cork, the Mercy Sisters. Had a big hospital in Eldama Ravine and a big maternity section there. And the nuns figured that they needed to educate me by having me attend a birth. So I attended my first birth and I managed to survive it without fainting or running out of the room. Then about 6 years later, I was actually back visiting in Eldama Ravine. In the meantime, I had moved on. I was working with a totally different tribe of people called the Kipsigis, different area. And I was back visiting one evening, and there was a huge thunderstorm, and it knocked out the generator. There was a big generator in the compound that provided electricity for everything, including the hospital. It knocked out the generator. And there was a surgery scheduled for a woman who was in labour, very difficult labour, and they were having to do a cesarean section. And there was no lights. There was no lights. So the entire surgery was carried out with the aid, literally, of a hurricane lamp. Somebody is holding a hurricane lamp while the doctor is doing surgery on the woman. And I was drafted in because the woman was a Kipsigis woman. She wasn't a local woman, she was Kipsigis, and nobody on the staff spoke Kipsigis. So I was drafted in, and my job was to speak to the woman throughout the surgery, because she wouldn't have general anaesthetic. She had a local anaesthetic just on the stomach, and so they're cutting her up with one person holding a lamp, and I'm talking her through it to try to distract her from what's happening 2 feet below her chin. So that was my second time. The third time was 1983, and I was in a totally different mission, a place called Cabernet. Now, very frequently, most people who live in Africa will get regular calls to take people to hospital in situations, and often pregnant women. And so this day, I'm called upon him. A father comes in, and his wife is very pregnant, in labour for many hours, to see if I can drive her to the nearest hospital, which was maybe 2 hours away. So I get her into the back of my Jeep, and just as we're about to start, she starts to give birth. So I stop the car, run back into the mission. I grabbed a bath towel that my mother had just given me a Christmas gift of a few weeks before, got it under, stretched it out in the back seat. I brought her scissors and 2 pieces of string. And she delivered her baby right in the bath towel. And having remembered what I'd seen them do, I tied off the umbilical cord and then squeezed the blood down a little bit, tied it off in the second place, and cut it in between. Wrapped the towel around the baby, put it on the mother's breast, and got back into the driver's seat and went like the hammers of hell down to the hospital. And they both did fine. So it's an extraordinary privilege to get to attend the birth of a baby. But however great a privilege it is to attend the birth of a child, I imagine it must be even more thrilling to attend the birth of a nation. So I wonder what it was like. Kenya got its independence 9 years before I went to Kenya. I wonder what it would have been like to have been in Kenya in December of 1963 when this country got its independence. A whole new nation got birthed. And I would have loved to have been alive in Ireland in Easter of 1916 when the modern Irish state got birthed. And I would dearly love to have been in this country in July of 1776 when our nation was born. I would dearly have loved it. And I want to talk a little bit about that today, given that in 2 days' time we are going to be deciding the fate of our nation again for the next 4 years at least. I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. Now the first 3 are a synopsis of an hour-long lecture I actually gave during the retreat in August up in Bishopsstrand. So if you want to get a more detailed instruction, check into that one. So I'm going to give a synopsized version of that and then add 2 other considerations. So firstly, I'm going to give a very brief history of the United States. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about America as empire. And then I'm going to talk about the future of America. Then fourthly, I'm going to talk about levels of leadership. And then fifthly, I'm going to talk about a couple of California propositions. So there'll be the 5 points I make this morning. So the first one, a brief history of the United States. I had the privilege, as I was preparing for this retreat in August, of bringing myself up to speed on American history, about which I had known absolutely nothing before that. And it was fascinating to me. And what I discovered firstly was that when I looked at the founding documents, the very interesting differences between them, that the Declaration of Independence, which was basically a Jeffersonian document, was this extraordinary vision which was light years ahead of its time. This man had a vision for the birth of a nation and had a vision for our world, in which he stated stuff like, "This we hold to be self-evident, that all people are created equal." In 1776, this was light years ahead of where most people were and where the world itself was. It was an extraordinary document. It set the tone for a vision of a new stage of humanity as far as I was concerned. It wasn't just a vision of birthing a new nation, it was a vision for birthing a whole new paradigm for how the world could be. So that was a document, an extraordinary visionary document. The second document was the Constitution. And the Constitution, which was a much more conservative kind of document. The Constitution basically was the federalization or the centralization of power, so that we figure out who governs under what kinds of circumstances. So it was much more a centralizing document and a nuts and bolts kind of document. And after that was finished, there was a third document called the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, seems to me, it was an effort to loosen up a little bit the Constitution, or to give protection to the ordinary citizens against the centralization and the federalization of the Constitution. So it was an effort to mediate between, where the first document from Jefferson was a vision for the future, and the second one was a constitution and nuts and bolts. The third one was some kind of protection for the citizenry against the government. So that's how we started. We were born with these 3 documents. And some of the very first issues were the following. The first one was voting. Who gets to vote? And there's a big kind of divide between basically a Jeffersonian impulse and a Hamiltonian impulse, Alexander Hamilton. And it is this. Hamilton rightly pointed out that only people who owned America should vote. Why would you allow people who didn't own America to vote in an American election? And the people who owned America literally were the landowners. And so people who owned land, as far as he was concerned, only they had the right to vote. Jefferson had a different instinct. Jefferson believed that anybody who's affected by government decisions has a right in the election of that government. So it's a very different understanding. The same thing happened with resources. At this stage, the North particularly is very much going industrial. And again, we had much of the resources in the hands of very few people. In fact, the government at some stage actually gave huge tracts of land and mines to what became known as the robber barons subsequently. And so again, with the founding of corporations, you had the same dialectic going. Hamiltonian kind of thinking, believing that those who own the resources have total control over the disposition of these resources. And other people with a Jeffersonian impulse saying, no, no, no. Everybody who's affected by what corporations do or how the resources are employed, those people too need some kind of input on how this is going. A man called Adam Smith weighed in on this last piece and claimed, yes, he held the same position vis-a-vis resources that Jefferson was holding around the voting process itself. So this was the kind of dialectic in which our nation was born. And it's not that one is a good guy and the other is a bad guy. They're both important impulses. Hamilton realized that you need to kind of reward creativity and the entrepreneurial spirit, which made America what it is. At the same time, that taken to extremes is very, very difficult. And Jefferson realizing that everybody has a right in the say of how resources and the country goes ahead. So it's very interesting parallel resources. And it's a kind of a dialectic that has continued down throughout modern America. That we still have these two impulses, and even within ourselves as individual citizens of the country, there are times when we think, you know, you need to reward people who have vision and creativity and let them lead us. Other stages we think, but everybody needs to have input. So we have these two impulses going side by side throughout our history. So when you look at the first three presidents, you see this in spades. Washington tended to be a more centralizing kind of figure. He was succeeded by John Adams, and Adams was much more so a centralizing figure. When Jefferson was elected in 1800, he had a very different spin on this. Jefferson was much more democratic in his thinking. And so, for instance, where up to now, senators were appointed by particular states to be members of the federal government, Jefferson would make them be elected by their states. They weren't just appointed by some person in the state, they were elected at a state level to go to federal government. What's little known of is that even in his own time, Jefferson, who had a very interesting, ambivalent attitude towards slavery, because he had slaves of his own and had a very interesting relationship with one of them, but he was against slavery. And in fact, while he was still governor of Virginia, before he was elected president in 1800, he suggested a bill that would have outlawed slavery in Virginia. And it was defeated by one vote. And the year afterwards, he put a second version in that would give freedom to slaves in the northern part of Virginia, and it passed. So way, 80 years before the Civil War, Jefferson had wrested freedom for slaves in the northern part of the Virginia territory. So he had a very different kind of a thinking. A third great impulse here then is the judiciary. Between the time that he was elected, Jefferson was elected in November of 1800, but at that stage in American politics, the president didn't take up office until the beginning of March the following year. So between his election in November 1800 and his taking office in March of 1801, John Adams put in a whole slew of federal judges who were very Hamiltonian in their thinking. And this would have a huge impact on the future of the country. Huge impact. So there's a famous case called the Dartmouth College case in 1819, when it's brought before the federal court an issue about corporations. And under the contract laws of the country, the judiciary decided to set up corporations, giving them all the same rights that individual citizens would have. And because it was made under the contract laws of the Constitution, a contract is a thing that one party cannot unilaterally dissolve. So the government finds itself in a position where the corporations have to agree to change. The government can no longer force them to change. And so this was a huge pillar in 1819, and it's very much definitely in place in our own times. Moving forward then towards Lincoln, the time of Lincoln. Lincoln was extraordinary for many reasons. Firstly, that he included in his own cabinet all those who had stood against him in the electoral campaign. a man of tremendous vision and compassion and tolerance and openness. But secondly, he had this vision that he wanted the Constitution to start to reflect the spirit of the founding document, the Declaration of Independence. He didn't want it to be this narrowly technical thing. He wanted it to be infused with the spirit and the vision of the Declaration of Independence. And he tried that throughout his entire presidency. Didn't succeed, obviously. And he moved forward to World War I. And World War I, which is arguably the first global conflict, the first conflict in which literally the entire world is involved. And at the end of that period, our president at that stage, Woodrow Wilson, made a very visionary and courageous stance. He did not want just to step into the void and have America become the next great superpower. He wanted to set up a new kind of global governance. And so he initiated the League of Nations. No, the League of Nations didn't take off. It failed for two reasons. It failed because the American Senate refused to ratify it, and it failed because then Hitler came into power in Europe and he had no interest whatsoever in globalization. And so it failed. But there was that extraordinary impulse that this genius had. That instead of America stepping into the gap at the end of World War I and creating a superpower, he was thinking now as a globe for the very first time. Since there had been a global conflict, he's thinking about global kinds of governance. During and after World War II, Roosevelt did pretty much the same thing. At the end of this process, Roosevelt would be a main mover behind the United Nations, behind the World Bank, behind the IMF, behind GATT, behind NATO, and behind the Marshall Plan. Again, this is a man with an opportunity to make the only superpower. Germany had been defeated, Japan had been defeated. Shortly, in our own times, Russia would be defeated. We would be the only superpower left. That was not Roosevelt's thinking. He wanted to try to create again a global vision where all human beings could have a say in the governance of our planet. Now, somehow that faltered. Between his time and our time, that extraordinary vision has ground to a halt and gone significantly backwards, where we no longer are moving forward as a global community to think as an entire planet, but more and more we're retrenching. And as the superpowers have dropped off and we become the only superpower, that brings me to my second point, America as empire. The truth is, de facto, we are an empire. We have moved from a republic to an empire. That's the truth. So we're going to have to deal with that. We exercise a totally disproportionate effect on world affairs. With 300 million people in this country, that's about 5% of the world's population, we exercise an influence far in excess of those numbers, and that's a fact. Now the question is, how do we exercise that? With what kind of a vision do we exercise that? Now the right is very happy with that situation, the left is appalled with that situation. The truth is, it is the reality. How do we deal with that kind of reality? Now, when we look at the history of empires, there are empires that collapse immediately, and there are empires that last a long time and then they collapse. We take typical examples. The Third Reich was meant to last for 1,000 years. It actually lasted 12 years. The Romans did last for 1,000 years. And when you study empires that succeed against empires that collapse, you see what happens is that very, very often colonialist powers who take over, if they somehow manage to create institutions of government that are regarded even by the governed as basically fair and just, the empire gets to continue to succeed. If the institutions erected by the governors over the governed are seen to be grossly unjust, it collapses really, really quickly. And that's our choice at this stage. We have the privilege of being the last empire on the planet. And by that I do not mean that our empire will continue for 1,000 years. It means that we get to be the midwives that preside over the end of empire. That we midwife a whole new consciousness in our planet in which there will be no need or no opportunity anymore for empires, where there will be truly global governance, where every human being on planet Earth will have a say about the resources and the freedoms and the government structures under which they live. That is our privilege as America, to be in a position, we have the resources, we have the skill set, we have the talent. If we only had the commitment, we could be birthing a whole new era of the human experience. So that's what it's like for America as empire. Which brings me to my third point. The future of America. As I look at the future of America, I want to look at what it might look like domestically and what it might look like in our foreign policy. And so I look at the notion of corporations. Corporations have given us so much of the wealth and the health we experience as a nation. Corporations are the reason why the country works as well as it works, why our technology works as well as it works. But there's always this dialectic between any group who confers a privilege upon us and at the same time begins to oppress. And so I would like to see the Bill of Rights extended to corporations. This has happened once before. The Bill of Rights was set up to protect citizens of America against the federal government. 100 years later, that was extended, and the Bill of Rights was extended so that we had the same protections against state governments. Now, what would happen if we had the same Bill of Rights vis-a-vis corporations? That we had the same say in how corporations conduct their activities. Not that they were kind of crippling them, but that we say to them, since we are affected by your decisions and your utilization of resources, whether it's global warming, whether it's strip mining, whatever it is, we have a say, and the Bill of Rights protects our say in how you conduct your activities. I would love to see that, something like that happening. I would like to see a different kind of democracy evolve. Democracy is not just voting on next Tuesday. Democracy is a much more complex phenomenon than that. So, for instance, Ralph Nader showed us in the 1960s that consumer advocacy is a very valid form of exercising democracy, looking out for the good of the consumers, whether it's in the auto industry that he was primarily invested in firstly, or in the food industry, or in the pharmaceutical industry, wherever it is, that consumer advocacy is a huge part of what it means to be democratically involved in the country. Another way of moving forward is to look at what happened in South Africa with Nelson Mandela. After he was freed from prison, 30 years in prison, an opportunity to exact extraordinary revenge on the whites of South Africa, he chose not to do it. He set up, or was part of setting up, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the rules of engagement were the following. They were more interested in finding out what really happened under apartheid, finding the truth, than punishing the predators. And so the agreement was, if you come in and you testify in public about your experiences during apartheid, whether as an African under the heel or as a white Afrikaner on top, if you're prepared to testify and tell us what really happened, there will be no repercussions. You're not going to get jailed, but it is important in order for us to effect reconciliation that we know what the truth is and that people fess up to what they've done. And it was an extraordinarily successful venture. The funny thing was, it was tried in South Carolina not that far long ago. They took cases from the 1970s where the Ku Klux Klan had murdered a group of black people, and they did the very same thing. Anybody who comes forward and testifies to the truth of what really happened, there will be no revenge against them, there'll be no legal proceedings, but we want to know what happened so that we can effect reconciliation. And it happened. That is how democracy works. Democracy is just not about, isn't just about voting. It's about exercising those kinds of community activities. It's also a fact that although the Patriot Act was passed, 150 different city governments throughout the United States are on record are saying they will refuse to implement the Patriot Act because they saw it as very unpatriotic. And so here, this kind of activity, this is democracy in action. When I think about democracy in action, I'm also thinking about that we genuinely need transparency and honesty in the voting process. It must be really seen to be true that those for whom we vote are those who receive our votes. Whatever we need to do to lay down some kind of a paper trail where it's obvious that people's wishes are being represented in the outcomes, that is important. That is democracy. I personally see that we need to re-liberate the press. That as the press is owned by fewer and fewer moguls, they're giving us viewpoints of these particular people, that the press needs to be really free to speak to us about their experience of what's happening in our globe. I see the importance of separating church and state. And I've said to you many times, separating church and state is not the same thing as separating politics from spirituality. They're very different. You cannot be a spiritual person and not be politically involved. You have the right and the obligation to try to represent your thinking and your belief systems and your mores and how the public sphere is conducted. But that's very different from party politics and narrow religious involvement in how things happen. Very, very different. But moreover, there has to be a bigger kind of a separation. There has to be a genuine separation among the kinds of leadership, the three arms, our judiciary, our legislature, and our executive. Those differences have been blurring over the last period of time. They need to be re-differentiated. We need to start differentiating between government and industry, so that industry, our government, is not in the pocket of industry. We need to start differentiating between real science and government. We're in a situation right now. I subscribe to an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they're really, really upset at what's been happening, where scientific reports are being written not by the scientists, but by government lawyers to represent the government agenda, suppressing actual science. There needs to be to get away from this piece again. And when I think about our domestic policy, when I think about the future of America, I think about things like, it is insane for me that we even debated what level of torture was acceptable. That we even debated that. That for me is really sick. We must reach out and try to restore once more our moral standing. We had extraordinary moral standing in our world at the end of World War II. We've been gradually losing it. We've really lost it over the last few years. And things like torture have led to that. We must be seen to hold the principles we espouse. So that kind of thing. We must also, it seems to me, become part of the world community again and start signing on to agreements like ecological agreements that we've been holding up. We must sign on to agreements on non-proliferation of nuclear arsenals, our weapons build-up. We must be seen to be the leaders in new technologies, new kinds of energy forms that don't punish our planet. And moreover, mostly, we have to begin to be seen as the catalyst for the birth of the next stage of what life on planet Earth will be like for all the denizens of the planet. That, it feels to me, is our future. That is our mission, and that is our privilege, given the extraordinary resources that we have as a nation. I want to think that in the future, we will ask ourselves the questions, and even as we go to vote, we will ask ourselves the question to ask not what the world can do for America, but what America can do for the world. That's my third point. My fourth point is this. I call it levels of leadership. As I've looked at leadership over my lifetime, having lived in Africa and studied human world history and lived in the United States for the last 21 years, as I look at leadership levels, I think there are 6 particular levels. The first level of leadership is this. Somebody either grabs power or manages to get themselves elected to a position of authority, but then they exercise that position totally for selfish reasons. It's about self-aggrandizement. And there have been plenty of examples of that, even in our lifetime, in your lifetime and in my lifetime. People who've either been elected to positions, taking Hitler in our time, who was elected by a democratic process and then totally dismantled the very democratic process that elected him and became a dictator. That's been repeated many, many times since then. So that's the worst kind of leadership. Leadership number 2, it seems to me, is somebody who gets elected and he rewards only his backers and the special interests who put him in power. And all of the legislation and all the agenda is geared towards rewarding these people who will presumably keep electing him in the future. That's the second kind of leadership. The third kind of leadership, it seems to me, is people who get elected by a particular, portion of a constituency, and then they exercise leadership for the benefit only of those who voted for them. And so if there was a 2-party state and I'm elected because I'm a member of one party, and then I choose to enact legislation and give preference to only people from that party, that's the third kind of leadership, it seems to me. The fourth kind of leadership is that I get elected by a group of my constituents, not everybody, a group of them, but as I exercise leadership on behalf of all of my constituents. Whether they voted for me or they did not vote for me, they're equally important and have equal rights to my time and my energy. That's level number 4. Level number 5 is to be elected to a position and to exercise my leadership, not just for all of the people in my constituency, but to be able to think beyond my own constituency. That is level 5 leadership. And for me, the top level 6 leadership is somebody who gets elected into a position and is able to think long term, not just the immediate future, not just about my re-electability in X number of years' time, but is able to think long term and is able to think as a global citizen, is exercising leadership on behalf of the entire planet, even though they were not elected to represent the planet. Maybe they were elected to be a president of a particular nation, but they're thinking of the planet and they're thinking long term for the good of all the denizens of the planet. For me, that is truly excellent kind of leadership. That's my fourth point. My fifth point is this: some California propositions, and I'm just going to mention two of them. And the first one I want to mention is proposition number 2. I don't know how off fair you are with the numbers here. It's a proposition that would give some just basic humanity to the process of raising our livestock. Just basic rights to animals, some of whom at this stage have crippled since birth. I'm thinking particularly of chickens, sheep, pigs and cattle, calves particularly, who are literally locked into a single position for the entire duration of a lifetime. They cannot even turn around. There's legislation, Proposition 2, attempting to undo some of the great excesses of that. Now when I think about that, I think about the mindset that would treat a sentient being in such a fashion. And I think about incidents from my own childhood. I think about when I watched cowboy and Indian movies as a small child. And I saw the difference between the Native American Indian attitude towards bison and the cowboys' attitude towards bison. The Native American Indians went out and they would kill what they needed. And that was it. The cowboys went out on shooting sprees and they just decimated and left thousands of rotting carcasses in their wake. They didn't even want them. It was just fun. They killed them. Either they needed the land for ranching or they did it for sport. They're two totally different mindsets. One is an attitude of, I need the meat to live, but I respect the person to whom the meat belongs, the cow or the bison or the sheep or whatever. And it's like I make a covenant, an agreement with them. And even the sacrificing is done with compassion. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. You've seen that movie? Set in South Africa, of a little bushman who found a Coke bottle and is being delegated by the tribe to bring the Coke bottle to the end of the world and throw it away because it's created such distress for them. And at one stage he's really hungry and he comes across an antelope, and there's this great scene where he's kneeling down and he's got his bow and arrow and he's in telepathic communication with the antelope. And there's an agreement going on here. Like the little man is saying, I need the meat to live. And the antelope is saying, okay, I donate the meat to live. And he shoots him and kills it. Now that's a very different attitude from crippling little critters inside in pens in situations where they're literally, and I'm not exaggerating, they literally never can turn around once in an entire lifetime. When I think about the need for compassion with all our little brothers and sisters, but that would be the main reason for saying yes to Proposition 2. But another reason would be this. All mammals experience emotions, all mammals, because we have limbic systems. And the biochemical carriers of emotion are the biochemicals in our bloodstream. They're brought throughout our system into our tissue by the bloodstream. And so the blood is the carrier of emotions. Biochemically, that's an actual scientific fact. So what do you think it is like when an animal is raised in total depression, is slaughtered in terror, and the blood that's running through his system for his entire lifetime is impregnating that energy in his tissue, and then I get to eat that tissue, that meat. I have a personal belief system that a lot of our chronic illnesses in our times, that a significant factor is the way we're eating and what we're eating and how what we're eating has been raised and how what we're eating has been killed. And I think there's not going to be any magic bullet that cures some of the chronic illnesses. It will be the humanitarian treatment of animals. Gandhi said famously one time, he said, you can judge the moral development of a nation by the way it treats its animals. So I certainly know that I would be voting for that proposition to give them some little bit of a break. The final point I want to make is Proposition 8. It's a proposition with a lot of money backing it to try to ban gay marriages. Now, I want to address this in a little bit of detail. Most of the people who are behind this are claiming scriptural authority for it. I think I'm a bit of an expert in the scriptures. And the first thing I see is this. Because I have read all of the scriptures of the world, I've come to the conclusion over my years that where the scriptures represent humankind's best effort to try to live with the notion of the transcendence guiding them, these are not documents. The scriptures are not documents that have been dictated by a divinity with every comma put in. If that were the case, then God certainly has an identity issue, because she's giving totally different commandments in the Quran than she is in the Tao Te Ching or the Judeo-Christian scriptures or the Bhagavad Gita. So God must be totally at variance with herself. There is no scripture, in my opinion, which is the dictated, revealed word of the divinity in specificity. That is not how the scriptures are written. They're the best effort that any culture could make to try to make sense of its experience on planet Earth while believing in a transcendence. And the scriptures need to be understood as that. Moreover, when you just narrow it down to the Judeo-Christian scriptures and you look at what they have to say about marriage, there is nowhere in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and I defy you to find it for me, there is nowhere in the Judeo-Christian scripture says the only understanding, the only valid understanding of marriage that God will allow is a covenant between one man and one woman. There is no place in scripture you'll find that. Au contraire, you'll find that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, they practiced polygamy. David, who's regarded in Israel as the quintessential king, the greatest king of all time, he had hundreds of wives. Solomon, who's regarded as the wisest man of all time, had 700 wives and then 300 concubines as well. How does that square with the notion that marriage is an agreement between one man and one woman only? You're not going to find it in scripture. Look at the notion of divorce. Protestant churches totally ignore what Christ allegedly spoke about divorce. He said, no, you can't divorce under any circumstances except if you can prove adultery against your partner. That's the only instance in which it's allowed. So says Christ in Mark's Gospel. What happened to that? The Protestant churches have totally ignored that. The Catholic Church says, yeah, that's the case, and then it creates a way around it. So you can get all the same excuses. You can get divorced, we just call it annulment, give it a different name. We call it annulment. You can get annulments for all the very same reasons as a Catholic, for which you could get them as a Protestant, except you have to use a different word. Can't call it divorce, call it annulment. What happened to that moral edict around marriages? How come all of the backers of Proposition 8 can let go of that piece? The truth is, when I examine the human trajectory, what I've seen is that when you look at it from the beginning to the end, there's this gradual rise, because we are evolving, we are developing. There's this gradual releasing in the human history, this gradual releasing of one prejudice after the other. When you really study human history in the long term, it is a history that involves letting go of one prejudice after another. Whether it's against the black community, whether it's against women voting, whether it's against child labour, whatever it is, we're letting go one by one of all the prejudices that hold us back. And we are embracing more and more, recognizing more and more, and embracing more and more the basic human rights that all people have to live in freedom and in happiness. Proposition 8, it seems to me, is an effort to halt this process and to send it backwards. Finally, I want to say this. We live in an extraordinary time. We live at a period where we are watching literally the birthing of a new consciousness on planet Earth. And the baby crowned about 2,500 years ago. It started crowning with the coming of Lao Tzu. It started coming with Confucius in China. It started coming with Mahavira and Gautama the Buddha in India. It started coming with Zoroaster in Persia. It started coming with Isaiah and Jeremiah in Israel. It started coming with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle in Greece. The baby was beginning to be birthed. It got finally birthed with the extraordinary avatar whom we call Jesus of Nazareth. But the baby is still attached to God the Mother by an umbilical cord. Our privilege and our responsibility in our times is to be able to cut that cord so Christ consciousness can be totally grounded in the human experience. We need to cut the cord on behalf of God the Mother so that we're living and dealing with an immanent God, a God who informs our thinking, a God who takes us beyond nationhood, a God who takes us beyond religion, a God who takes us beyond gender, and a God who takes us beyond all prejudice, so that in our times we can see the beginning of Christ consciousness in day-to-day life on planet Earth.